Hi, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure and an honor to speak with Omar. We've taken the show on the road now to a few different states and cities. And I was thinking as I was listening to Omar's talk that he's playing the role of the philosopher tonight, and I'm playing the role of the totally non-gendered cheerleader. In that I really want to focus on what's going on in the United States in the BDS movement through the lens, mostly, because it's what I know best, of Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization that I'm a part of. For those of you who don't know JVP, we're a grassroots membership organization inspired by Jewish tradition to work for the freedom, equality, and security of all the peoples of Israel and Palestine. And we're talking about BDS at 10, and JVP has really gone through its own journey of engagement with BDS that I want to share with you a little bit. Earlier this year, we announced our new BDS policy, fully endorsing the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And that was a long process, and for those of you who are still on the fence, I want to talk about it a little bit. It was one that started back in 2004 when our Bay Area chapter, which at the time was the entirety of JVP, decided to target Caterpillar, which was the company that had provided Israel with the bulldozer that killed the young American activist Rachel Corrie. That's how we first came to know about that company. And since that time, we've sort of slowly increased our commitment to BDS tactics. So we had a sort of complicated dance which took into account the feelings of our members, what they were willing to do, outside political conditions, which have certainly deteriorated. When we started this work, the wall wasn't even built yet, for example. And our strong relationship with the BDS movement. And I do have to pause to say how grateful I am to the Boycott National Committee, and to Omar in particular, for being really so patient with us and welcoming us as part of the movement throughout this process, and really allowing us to take the time we needed to move to this position. It's been a very gratifying evolution of that relationship. And we were ready to make the move because it was very clear to us, and it is very clear to us, that BDS is the leading strategy and set of tactics to bring justice for the Palestinian people. So the ongoing occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, the Golan Heights, the ongoing oppression of Palestinian citizens inside of Israel, the many decades that Palestinian refugee rights have been ignored, is unethical and unsustainable. Unfortunately, Israel's been able to maintain these policies through the complicity and the cooperation of other governments, primarily ours, and so we have a particular responsibility to take that on. So we see BDS as a vital and growing nonviolent tool to pressure Israel when our government will not. And it's a response to the US using every aspect of its power, economic, political, diplomatic, to make us complicit in Israel's policies of occupation and disenfranchisement and oppression. So despite the formidable obstacles we face, and they are quite formidable, we really are making great progress. And we're behind the rest of the world, but we are making a lot of progress. So some of the things Omar mentioned, but I wanted to talk just about some of the victories of the last year. Starting in June, less than a year ago, although it seems a million years ago, I have to say, but it was only last June that JVP was really proud to stand with our allies in the Presbyterian Church, who became the first mainline church in the United States to divest from 3 companies profiting from the occupation. And that was the result of a hard-fought campaign of 10 years. And as Omar was mentioning, so important to be strategic and careful and committed to doing these campaigns. It's not just about saying, I support BDS and that's the end of the story. Supporting BDS means taking on a campaign, finding the right target, and committing to seeing it through. And it's also an indicator, this particular campaign, the fact that the church was able to make this decision, of how critiques of Israeli policy in the United States are moving from the margins and into the mainstream, and are moving beyond critique only into concrete action. I think we're going to see a lot more of that given the new Israeli government that was just announced tonight. In November, we had SodaStream, a company whose main factory is in an Israeli settlement, announced that its factory will close, which is a major victory for the global movement. And while SodaStream is now moving to the Negev inside the Green Line and will and should continue to be a target of the BDS movement, that does not at all negate how great a victory that was. Last fall, we were really proud. JVP, it was the first time a JVP chapter successfully led a local boycott campaign. So the city of Durham, North Carolina, which for the last 11 years has been using G4S as a security contractor, has now severed that contract and is opening it up to other bidders explicitly because of G4S's complicity in human rights abuses against Palestinians. As far as we know, that's the first time a city government has boycotted a company because of its role in perpetuating justice in Israel and Palestine. So this victory builds on other recent decisions to divest from G4S, which is becoming a bigger and bigger target. The Gates Foundation and United Methodist Church, Omar mentioned, have also chosen to divest from G4S. Just 2 days ago, the fact that Lauryn Hill pulled out of a concert in Israel is an extraordinary victory of the cultural boycott movement. And I want to talk a little bit also about the evolution of the boycott movement on campuses, which in a lot of ways is the engine for the growth of the BDS movement here. So divestment campaigns are moving faster and faster all over the country, and that's thanks, of course, to the amazing organizing efforts of Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. Just as a little, they deserve that applause. So from 2003 to 2009, there was a total of 3 campuses around the country that passed divestment initiatives. This year, so far, the year's not over, there's several more that aren't active, but this year, resolutions have already passed at colleges including Loyola University in Chicago, Wesleyan University, Oberlin College, Evergreen State College, Earlham College, Stanford, and University of California campuses at Berkeley, Irvine, Los Angeles, and Riverside. And I think it's really important to name all, I wanted to name all of them. It's a little repetitive maybe to go through the whole list of names of schools, but just to get a sense of the breadth of what's happening all over the country that's like really popping up all over. There's also been student referendums on divestment at Princeton, at DePaul, and at San Diego State. And it actually lost, what's interesting is that lost narrowly at Princeton and San Diego and won narrowly at DePaul. But what's notable, I think, is that each vote split approximately 50-50. So the Forward was writing about that this week, and this is what they said. They said, quote, "Whatever the outcome in any particular case, this is now a very live and closely divided question for American college students." And that's a real change over the past several years. Of course, there's also moves on for faculty on campus. I know a lot of faculty are here. There's large numbers of faculty, particularly at NYU, at Princeton, at Vassar, who have publicly joined efforts to divest, to get their campuses to divest from companies profiting from the occupation. And faculty associations, from the Middle East Studies Association, the National Women's Studies Association, to the American Studies Association, are all taking on this topic and affirming in various different formations the rights of faculty to engage in these debates and even to endorse academic boycotts. So JVP has actually recently formed an academic advisory council. We initially have about 550 faculty who have signed on from every discipline across the country, and they're beginning to speak out against intimidation and silencing of dissent and in support of freedom of expression about Israel and Palestine, and that's despite the enormous organized efforts of donors and administrators and right-wing organizations. Also in the last year, after the American Studies Association decided to vote to endorse the academic boycott of Israel, there was a very intense backlash. And there was actually 4 states, New York, Maryland, Illinois, and Florida, that actually passed legislation, or attempted to pass legislation to punish that decision with fiscal consequences for especially state-run schools that got state money. And the case I know best was here in New York, and it was really quite extraordinary. The legislation was brought by Sheldon Silver, now disgraced and arrested, but at the time still the most powerful figure in the state assembly. And he, we found out about the legislation, I think it was 3 days before it had already passed the assembly. It was something like 3 days before it could pass the Senate. The assumption was that it was going to pass. We threw together a coalition that included First Amendment groups, ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, groups like JVP, the U.S. Campaign to End the Occupation, Students for Justice in Palestine, and we were also able to get the faculty union to come out against it. This legislation was written in a way that was punishing faculty specifically, where they would be losing fiscal resources, and so they were willing to come into this fight, and that was critical. We were able to meet with the New York Times about it. Eventually, the New York Times editorialized against it, and that bill was defeated, as they were also in Maryland, Illinois, and Florida. So I think the lesson here is that politicians can't anymore, or at least I think we could say we're starting, to be able to say that politicians can't any longer try to score political points just by pushing through mindless pro-Israel legislation. We are starting, at least on the state level, to be able to impose a cost. And that is a real shift. Now, that being said, our opposition is regrouping, as expected. The Illinois State Senate just passed a bill in the last week. It's moving through the House now that calls for state retirement systems to divest from and blacklist companies that abide by human rights boycotts of Israel. And the Tennessee General Assembly just passed a bill condemning BDS. Meanwhile, in Congress, amendments have been attached to trade legislation that would institutionalize support for the Israeli occupation and attempt to criminalize nonviolent boycotts of Israel. If they end up being passed, and it is a big if, the legislation would reverse the longstanding US policy of opposing illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories by de facto recognizing all settlements as part of Greater Israel. The proposed legislation would also mandate US government actions to track and penalize commercial boycotts, which is a violation of constitutionally protected political speech. Now, as far as I'm concerned, these legislative initiatives are an indicator of our strength. I think when the federal government finds it necessary to legislate against our movement, we know that we are making progress. And that's not to downplay the seriousness of this challenge or our need to fight it wholeheartedly, but just to remember how social movements work, how long it takes for us to make progress, and how the closer we come to winning, the stronger the opposition pushes back. And that's the sort of dialectic of the way social movements emerge. And so that's, this is part of the process. And I think, of course, at JVP, we're very connected to and concerned about the Jewish community in particular, and we know that the Jewish world in the United States recognizes BDS as the greatest threat to a change in the status quo. And they're way more scared of BDS than they ever were of the peace process. And for that reason, Jewish institutions are putting literally millions of dollars a year into fighting BDS at every level. At Princeton, we had found out that the local Hillel had actually contracted with a PR firm that spent millions of dollars trying to defeat the referendum. It still was almost 50-50. At Santa Cruz, the Hillel now has hired a staffer whose only job, literally full-time, is to fight BDS on campus. So they are really, finding it necessary to fight this with all the resources they have, which are considerable.
And UCLA?
At UCLA?
Hillel
Well,
there's UCLA,
yeah, if we had to mention every Hillel where they were fighting BDS, it would take this would be a long talk. But yes, yes, indeed. At UCLA, it's been an enormous issue. The Jewish, institutional world has really made BDS a red line. And a lot of people do call BDS anti-Semitic. I think Omar did a beautiful job of refuting that. But I just did want to say that we strongly disagree with that characterization, and that it cannot be anti-Semitic to hold a state, any state, including Israel, accountable for human rights violations, for enforcing inequality, and for its systems of oppression. And that misuse of the term anti-Semitism really makes a mockery of truly anti-Semitic incidents and makes it dangerously possible for people to take true anti-Semitism less seriously. So while accusations of anti-Semitism have always been used to suppress open discussion of Israel and Palestine, we've entered a new phase where there are actually attempts to legislate a definition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel. There's actually a resolution right now that's passing its way through the California legislature that would do just that. And that is the culmination of years, if not decades, of efforts by big Jewish institutions to dangerously redefine what anti-Semitism is. So we really are a little bit playing catch up. We have our work cut out for us in that arena. I think it's really important that we fight around that concept because that redefinition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of the state is an exceptionally dangerous one, not just about Israel, but for countries around the world. But again, things are shifting so fast. I have so many stories that I wish I could share, but I will say we just had our national membership meeting in March. A very wealthy philanthropist who's known for supporting the Friends of the IDF. His daughter was at our national membership meeting as a JVP member. We had a very prominent, we have these stories almost every week. We had a very prominent opponent of BDS whose son just applied for a job at JVP. So all the time we're having these stories. The generational shift that is happening is real, it's anecdotal, and it's also quantifiable. So we feel very heartened by that. And then on a more macro level, the recent organizing to get members of Congress to skip the speech, as we called it, that was Netanyahu's speech to Congress a month or two ago, was really a surprising success. 60 members skipped, you could even say boycotted, the speech. We are seeing Israel, you know, that was the real opening. I thought it was, we may look back and see that as a real change moment where it's turning Israel from an issue of bipartisan consensus into a partisan issue. And that could be the key to future changes in US policy. And then we have, of course, the recent election in Israel, which was, you know, very much on the heels of Netanyahu's speech. And Netanyahu really won by explicitly playing to racist fears. And I think that can only push those who care about democracy and speaking out against racism into action. And the makeup of the new government, which was just announced this afternoon, which looks like it's going to be one of the most extreme right-wing governments in Israeli history, Habayit HaYehudi, which is one of, you know, basically a fascist party, and I don't use that word lightly, is going to be controlling the justice ministry, the education ministry, and possibly the foreign ministry. They'll be gutting the court system further than it already is. And so I think there's some, you know, people are going to need to make some serious decisions about at what point is their limit. Although one would think that the war in Gaza would have done that this summer already. But so we're seeing that shift in the public understanding of this issue. And you know, there's been a lot of polls since the war on Gaza this summer, and it shows that the U.S. population, that the people most willing to be critical of Israeli policies are African Americans, Latinos, and young people. And that's the future of this country. That's the way the way things are going. Young people of all races and ethnicities. And a J Street poll last fall even showed that 49% of all people under 30 support settlement boycotts. 49% of all Jewish people under 30 support settlement boycotts. So that's an indicator of the shift. And then I did want to go back to something that Omar mentioned, which is the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's really already had a profound impact on how many of us are thinking about race and racism in this country, and what our responsibilities are, especially those of us who are in a position of privilege, to fight it. So it wasn't surprising to me that as the Black Lives Matter movement emerged, our JVP chapters just organically all over the country began participating in and leading solidarity actions and support. I mean, of course we want to be part of this anti-racist movement as JVP, because many, if not most of us at JVP, for JVP is our political home. It's the place we can bring our full selves, and we don't have to leave our politics in Israel and Palestine at the door, which is what we're often asked to do in other organizations. But I think even more fundamentally, it made us realize in a new way that fundamentally JVP is an anti-racist organization. So of course our members are going to be on the streets for Black Lives Matter, just like they were for Gaza this summer. Our anti-racist principles make us part of a broad coalition, one that brings many movements together, whether fighting for immigrant rights, or against the prison industrial complex, or for justice in Palestine. It's really different facets of the same fight for the full equality and dignity of all human beings. And just last week, we saw remarkable scenes of Israelis of Ethiopian descent protesting against police brutality in Tel Aviv, and they were explicitly evoking the parallels with what was happening in Baltimore. And then there was a pretty remarkable tweet that made the rounds of social media. A black man in jail in New York during the protests in solidarity with Baltimore reported he was sitting in jail wearing his Palestine shirt and found himself sitting next to a Palestinian wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. So those are moving displays of solidarity and joint struggle, and I think really a vision of what we can build. And of course we have to be careful not to instrumentalize or universalize these related but different movements and honor the differences between them, which are many, but we can still learn from and draw inspiration from each of them. And for those of us in this movement who are white, we have to be prepared to stretch and challenge our own thinking. Just as for many of us, especially those of us who are Jewish, it was so hard to learn that Israel was not what we thought it was. It's hard to grapple with our own positions of power and privilege here in the United States. But we can't let that grappling or that fear lead to paralysis. We have to be willing to stand up for what's right. And that's why I have so much hope that the many, many young people who came out into the streets for the first time in Ferguson and Baltimore and New York and other cities around the country in solidarity are going to be able to look at the situation in Israel-Palestine with a fresh eye, a fresh anti-racist eye, and become ready for action. So if taking on police violence and the prison industrial complex is anti-racist work, then BDS is a tool of anti-racist solidarity, whether here or in Palestine. So it all adds up to an acceleration of a trend that I think was already in place, and that's more and more visible. And it's apparent, in all spheres, from the media to what politicians are saying behind closed doors, to the conversations parents are having with their children, or really what children are having with their parents is, I think, the better way to say it. A new understanding of the role that Israel plays and more willingness to say it out loud. And that change in discourse is really the prerequisite for eventually changing policy. And so at JVP, we're understanding that more and more, because since last year's awful summer, as the only major Jewish organization to unequivocally oppose what was being done to Gaza, we have now grown literally 3 times the size we were last June. You guys are a fun crowd. We went from 40 to over 65 chapters. Some of our new chapters are in places like Rochester and Indiana and Central Ohio. We have 2 new chapters in Texas, just to sort of get a sense, we're getting out of the big cities and really into the heartland, I suppose you would call it. We have 60,000 new online supporters, so we're now up to 200,000 online supporters. We went from having 57,000 Facebook likes to over 200,000. We went from having 12,000 Twitter followers to 42,000. And it's not just a matter of naming the largest of the numbers. It means that we also have a reach of our own, that we can bypass the mainstream media. We're not dependent on them necessarily to cover us, because we can create our own media and our own buzz, which is extremely important. And our chapters really were forged in the crucible of this summer. Some of them were out, 3, 4, 5 nights a week. Many people in this room were out 3, 4, 5 nights a week protesting all summer long. And they've grown enormously in size and strength and savvy as activists. So that's really, really important for going forward. So just to finish up, I want to say that I'm really proud, and I think this is a nice corollary to how you put it, Omar. I'm really proud to be part of a broad movement that values all the voices and perspectives that are part of it, including mine. And some of the most hopeful moments that I've witnessed doing this work have been watching student-led divestment hearings, where we have Indigenous and African American and Latino and queer and Jewish and Muslim and Christian, South Asian, you name it, they're there. Multi-ethnic groups of students building principled and effective coalitions in solidarity with Palestine. This issue, like the anti-apartheid struggle before it, is really one of the great moral issues of our time. And so I really want to urge folks who are teetering on the edge, folks who identify as being on the side of freedom and equality, to join us in embracing and encouraging all forms of nonviolent pressure on Israel, including and especially BDS. The tide is really turning, and this is the opportunity to be on the right side of history. Thank you.